Hungry old man, I'll give you my Ferrari if you can start it. Hungry old man, Julian Arce shouted amid laughter, pointing mockingly in front of everyone. I'll give you my Ferrari if you can start it. The room erupted in laughter. Men in suit and women in formal dresses looked at him with contempt, celebrating the humiliation as if it were a spectacle. Under the crystal chandeliers, the bright red of the car reflected the millionaire's arrogance. To one side, Don Ernesto Salgado stood motionless. His wrinkled face, worn jacket, and downcast eyes revealed fatigue and pain, but also a quiet dignity that no one there recognized. While the others enjoyed themselves at his expense, he clutched his jacket on his shoulder as if clinging to the last shred of pride he had left. That moment was the beginning of a confrontation that no one at that gala would ever forget. Before we begin this exciting story, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and leave your like to continue following us. Mexico City. That night, it shone like a stage built for gods. At the city Banamex Center, white and gold lights fell on a car that seemed to breathe. The red Ferrari rested on an acrylic platform surrounded by velvet ropes. It wasn't a car, it was an altar. Every glint on the bodywork was mesmerizing. Every reflection of glass made the guests raise their glasses as if celebrating a personal victory. The initial roar of the engine still vibrated in everyone's chest. That deep metallic sound had cut through the air like controlled thunder. It smelled of refined gasoline, freshly baked new leather. Triumph. It was a scent that those present associated with power. And at the center of that orchestra of vanity was Julian Arce wearing a tailored black suit, an Italian silk tie, and the insolent shine of a Swiss watch that captured the light like a small sun. He walked among the guests with a smile that mixed confidence and contempt, the expression of someone who had never heard the word no. Listen, he said as he caressed the steering wheel with his fingertips. He accelerated slightly and the roar returned. Deep, perfect, the echo bounced off the walls of the hall like an amplified heartbeat. There was applause, whistles, excited laughter. Julian bowed his head, enjoying being the center of gravity of the night. But at the edge of the circle of luxury, a contrast stood out like a stain on polished marble. An old man, hunched over, wearing a worn coat that had lost its color and shape. His shoes looked like they had survived too many rainstorms. His beard grew wildly, mixing gray hairs and dust. The security guard noticed him immediately and raised his hand sternly. "Sir, please keep your distance." The old man did not protest. He merely raised his palms in a sign of peace, with a respect that hurt more than any plea. His eyes, however, did not move from the car. He looked at the Ferrari with a tenderness that no millionaire in that room understood. It was not greed, it was not a desire to own it. It was memory, like someone looking at the portrait of a lost child. A woman in an emerald green dress, Fernanda, saw him stop at the curb. She watched him silently for a few seconds, surprised by the way his hands trembled. Not from cold, but from contained emotion. "Do you like it?" she asked in a soft voice, almost afraid to interrupt that intimate moment. The old man nodded slowly without words. He tried to smile, but his throat was closed by an invisible knot. He took a deep breath as if he needed to fill his lungs with the scent of hot metal. There was more than admiration in his gaze, a hidden sparkle of someone who recognizes what others only contemplate. Julian, meanwhile, had noticed the scene. He approached with calculated steps, enjoying the effect he was having. His shadow fell over the old man like a sudden eclipse. The room fell silent for a few seconds, and the electronic music stopped at that very moment, as if the universe were setting the stage for the first thrust. The engine stopped roaring, and before the lights changed color, Julian's dry laughter pierced the air, opening a corridor of expectant glances. The invisible thread holding the old man up was about to snap. The echo of Julian's laughter spread like a whip across the silence. The guests turned their heads toward him, ready to applaud any word that came out of his mouth. At these gatherings, no one wanted to be his enemy. Everyone preferred to laugh even if they didn't understand the joke. "Look at that," he exclaimed, pointing at the old man with his index finger as if he were part of a show. "You don't even have enough to eat, old man. Why are you looking at my Ferrari as if it were yours?" Laughter erupted all around. Some of it was sincere, some of it uncomfortable. but all of it resonated like a wall against the man in the worn coat. Fernanda looked down, ashamed of the cruelty disguised as humor. The guard tried to pull the old man away, but he didn't move. He stood firm, his eyes fixed on the car, as if those words bounced off an invisible wall built with memories stronger than any humiliation. The old man swallowed hard. His jaw trembled, but not from fear. It was contained rage, an ancient fire he preferred not to show. However, his hands betrayed a slight tremor, as if each laugh were a direct blow to his empty stomach. "Leave him alone, Camillo," Julian ordered the guard, raising a hand like a magnanimous emperor. "Let's have some fun." The crowd gathered in a semicircle, wine glasses and cell phones held high. The air smelled of expensive perfume mixed with the tension of an impromptu show. Julian walked to the front of the Ferrari and, in a theatrical voice, delivered his final taunt. "You know what, old man? I'm going to make you an impossible offer." He turned to his audience, enjoying the anticipation. "If you can start my Ferrari with your own hands, I'll give it to you." The burst of laughter was immediate. Some even applauded the idea. The absurd phrase seemed like the perfect joke for a night of ostentation. "Come on, Julian," shouted a man with a glass in his hand. "That poor guy doesn't even know what a modern engine is. He can't even start a bicycle," added another, provoking more laughter. The old man looked up at Julian for the first time. His gaze was neither pleading nor fearful. It was a silent edge, a reflection of dignity buried under years of neglect. The millionaire didn't notice. He was too busy playing the role of cruel jester in front of a complacent audience. Fernanda looked at the old man's face and something inside her shuddered. She had seen many looks of defeat, but this was not one of them. There was a dangerous calm, the same calm of someone who knows secrets that others are unaware of. "What do you say, old man?" Julian insisted, holding out the keys as if they were another mockery. "Do you accept my challenge?" The room held its breath. No one expected the man to respond. It was too absurd to even imagine him approaching the machine that everyone revered as a sacred object. The old man blinked slowly. Then, in a hoarse but clear voice, he uttered what no one expected to hear. "I accept." The collective murmur turned into a sea of disbelief. Everyone's eyes widened, and even the laughter froze midair. The old man's calm had cut through the frivolity like an invisible knife. For the first time that night, Julian lost his smile. The murmurs did not stop. The guests, with glasses of wine in their hands and the glow of the lamps reflecting off their jewelry, continued to stare in disbelief at the old man who had broken the dynamic of the evening. Don Ernesto Salgado, with his worn coat and unkempt beard, had uttered two words that seemed out of place in that luxurious setting. "I accept." The echo of that response left the room in suspense, and the electronic music that began to play again managed to mask the electricity in the air. Everyone looked at each other as if searching for an explanation. Had the old man dared to take Julian Arce's joke seriously? The millionaire, still with his sharp smile, adjusted his tie and feigned indifference. He couldn't show any doubts in front of his audience. He walked slowly toward the car, enjoying being the center of attention, and held out the keys with a theatrical gesture. "Go ahead, Mr. Nobody. If you want it so badly, start it up. Surprise us." The laughter multiplied. Some recorded with their phones, convinced that this would end up in a viral video of a beggar making a fool of himself. Others drank quickly, as if they didn't want to miss a thing. The guard Camillo shifted uncomfortably, but Julian stopped him with an arrogant gesture. He wanted a show. Don Ernesto walked toward the stage. His footsteps echoed on the marble, slow and heavy, contrasting with the shiny shoes and heels of the others. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, and that strange calm began to make more than one person uncomfortable. "What do you think he's going to do?" asked a woman in a low voice. "He won't even know where the button is," replied a man with a laugh. But Fernanda Villalobos wasn't laughing. There was something about the old man's expression that she found impossible to ignore. His hands were shaking, yes, but not like those of someone who was scared, but like those of an artist facing his instrument after too long. That trembling was pure, contained emotion, like a river about to break its banks. Julian turned the keys between his fingers and, in an act of contempt, threw them on the floor. They fell with a dry clink near the old man's feet. There was laughter. Don Ernesto bent down, picked up the keys gently, and stared at them for a few seconds. His fingers caressed them with a delicacy that baffled those watching him closely. No one understood why that gesture seemed so intimate. "Come on, old man, show us your magic," said Julian, opening his arms like a master of ceremonies. The old man got into the car. The crowd fell silent. Sitting in the leather seat, he closed his eyes for a moment. He breathed in the smell of the interior. Worked leather, oil, hot metal. It was a scent that penetrated him to the bone. He placed his hands on the steering wheel with solemn respect. And for a second, he no longer looked like a beggar, but someone returning home after a long exile. The guests began to grow restless. Some whispered, others recorded more closely. "Come on, start it already." A young man laughed from the back, but Don Ernesto did not rush. First, he adjusted the seat with precise movements. Then he touched the gear shift. He caressed it with the back of his fingers as if greeting an old companion. Then he scanned the dashboard, and his eyes lit up with a brief flash that was impossible to fake. Fernanda watched him with her heart racing. This was no stranger improvising. There was a secret memory there that no one could yet decipher. Finally, Don Ernesto inserted the key. The entire room held its breath. The old man's finger rested on the ignition button, and then he turned his wrist with disconcerting calm. The roar of the engine was about to decide who would laugh and who would be silent that night. The silence was so thick that you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Everyone waited with bated breath, ready to laugh if the engine failed to start, or to be amazed if, by some improbable miracle, the old man succeeded. Don Ernesto turned the key with a firm, almost ceremonious movement. The Ferrari's engine responded with a deep, powerful roar that filled the room like metallic thunder. The echo bounced off the windows, made the lamps vibrate, and seeped into the hearts of every guest. The crowd burst into a muffled cry. Surprise, disbelief, even fear. Julian Arce blinked, taken aback. His smile disappeared for the first time that night. He had expected a resounding failure, an easy comedy. Instead, the old man had awakened the machine as if he had been born with it. Don Ernesto was unmoved by the reactions. With the engine running, he remained motionless for a few seconds, listening to the roar as if recognizing a familiar voice. Then he caressed the steering wheel with his fingertips and murmured something barely audible, a whisper that only Fernanda could hear, as if you had never been turned off. She looked at him in surprise. It wasn't the words of a stranger, but of someone talking to an old friend. The guests began to react. Some applauded nervously, others recorded frantically. The laughter had vanished. In its place reigned a mixture of fascination and bewilderment. How did he do that?" asked one man aloud. "It was probably just luck," replied another, trying to regain his mocking tone, although his voice trembled. Julian, irritated, stepped forward. He couldn't let the scene get out of hand. "All right, old man, you managed to start it. So what? Does that make you the owner of my Ferrari?" His tone was meant to sound sarcastic, but his nervousness betrayed him. Don Ernesto calmly turned off the engine and slowly got out of the car. There was no pride in his gestures, nor fear, only serenity. He handed the keys to Julian without extending them fully, as if to remind him that the promise was still on the table. "You said you'd give it to me if I started it." His voice was deep, firm, without tremor. The crowd murmured again. Cell phones recorded every word. It was no longer a private show, it was a public trial. Julian laughed forcedly. "It was a joke, man. No one expected you to really try." He looked around for support. Several people laughed, but the laughter sounded hollow, like an echo without conviction. Fernanda, on the other hand, did not take her eyes off Don Ernesto. There was something about him that grew with every gesture, a silent dignity that began to impose itself on luxury and contempt. The old man took a step toward Julian. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make a fuss, but the gleam in his eyes was enough to make the millionaire uncomfortable. "Words have weight, young man, and everyone here heard yours." A chill ran through the room. The humiliation was beginning to shift direction, although no one yet understood how much remained to be revealed. The murmur of the audience turned into a restless wave. No one knew which side to take. Some looked at Julian Arte with expectation, hoping he would reassert himself as the undisputed king of the night. Others looked at Don Ernesto with unexpected respect, as if something invisible forced them to remain silent. Julian regained his forced smile and raised his voice. Do you really think this old man has a right to anything? He laughed, raising his wine glass. Starting a car doesn't make you the owner. Anyone could do it if they were lucky. Don Ernesto, instead of responding with words, turned his gaze to the Ferrari. He leaned over, opened the front hood, and lifted it with a confident movement. The engine glistened under the lights of the hall, a metallic heart laid bare. The crowd leaned forward curiously. What is he doing? Asked a woman in the front row. The old man ran his hand over the parts without touching them, as if reading a braille book. He pointed to a valve and muttered, poorly calibrated. The adjustment is minimal, but it reduces starting power. The comment struck like lightning. Some laughed, others were left speechless. Julian tensed up. And what do you know about calibrations? He said dismissively. Don Ernesto stared at him without looking away. I know enough to recognize that someone has pushed this engine too hard on the track. They pushed it too hard in fifth gear. If they keep doing that, it will blow up before 10,000 kilometers. A heavy silence fell over the room. Several guests, experts in luxury cars, exchanged worried glances. What the old man was saying didn't sound like fiction. It sounded like an accurate diagnosis. Fernanda, her heart racing, couldn't contain herself. How can you know that? She asked aloud, breaking the barrier of murmurs. Don Ernesto simply closed the hood calmly. Engines speak, young lady. You just have to know how to listen to them. The phrase hung in the air, laden with a strange weight. Some of the guests felt a chill. This was not a beggar speaking, but someone who knew secrets they would never understand. Julian, increasingly uncomfortable, tried to regain control, stepping forward and holding out his hand, demanding the keys. Enough of this charade, give me that and get out of here. But Don Ernesto didn't move. He clutched the keys in his bony hand and replied in a low voice, so low that everyone had to lean in a little to hear him. You called me to the stage, Julian. You gave me your word. The audience held its breath. The tension was so thick that it seemed as if even the air had stopped circulating. Julian swallowed hard. He couldn't allow an old man with nothing to corner him in front of everyone. It was a joke, he repeated, more nervous than before. No one here believes you have the right to... I do, interrupted Fernanda, surprising everyone. Her voice rang out firm and clear, breaking the audience's complicity with the millionaire. Several people turned toward her. The young woman took a step forward and looked at Don Ernesto with respect. A man who treats a machine with such care is not just anyone. The silence was absolute. Julian looked at her with contained fury, but the seed had already been planted. The audience was beginning to doubt who deserved their admiration that night. The tension in the room was unbearable. The recent roar of the engine still vibrated in everyone's bones, and now the silence was louder than any music. Julian Arce took a sip of wine in one gulp, as if the alcohol could give him back control, but his eyes revealed a growing fury. What are you implying, Fernanda? He snapped with a forced smile that barely hid the venom in his voice. Do you think this beggar knows more about my Ferrari than I do? Fernanda held his gaze without fear. I don't know how much he knows, she said slowly, glancing sideways at Don Ernesto. But I know what I see, and what I saw was respect, not mockery. That sets him apart from everyone else here. A murmur ran through the room. Some guests looked down, uncomfortable. Others whispered among themselves, debating whether the young woman was right. Julian clenched his fists. He wasn't used to anyone stealing his thunder, much less a wizened old man and a woman who dared to contradict him in public. Don Ernesto remained standing with the keys still in his hand. He hadn't moved an inch, as if his calmness shielded him from everything. Then, with a slow gesture, he opened the driver's door again. An engine isn't just started, he said in a hoarse voice. You hear it, you feel it, you understand it. He sat down in the seat, turned the key again, and the roar filled the space once more. This time, instead of turning it off immediately, he accelerated gently, measuring each vibration. He moved the lever, adjusted the steering wheel, pressed a couple of buttons that no one had noticed. The sound of the engine changed, becoming more refined, as if the car were suddenly responding to an expert hand that understood it from within. The injection system is out of sync, he murmured, without raising his voice. Several men in the audience, connoisseurs of luxury cars, exchanged alarmed glances. One of them couldn't contain himself and stepped forward. That's right. I noticed something strange when it started, but I thought it was my imagination. The old man nodded calmly without looking at anyone. It's not your imagination. The machine always speaks. The audience burst into whispers. Some looked at Julian with disapproval. The cornered millionaire tried to fight back. Enough, he shouted, his face red. This is nothing but a cheap trick. Don Ernesto slowly turned off the engine, got out of the car, closed the door with a gentle gesture, and walked toward Julian. His steps, though slow, echoed louder than the music. He looked him straight in the eye. There are no tricks here, only knowledge. Fernanda moved, took a step forward. The divided crowd fell into reverent silence. At that moment, Julian understood something that made his blood run cold. People were no longer laughing with him. They were watching him as the jester of the night. And Don Ernesto, with unshakable calm, was about to deliver the next blow without raising his voice. The air in the room was thick, as if every lamp were giving off electricity. The crowd had moved closer, forming a tight circle around the Ferrari, Julian Arce, and the old man who seemed less and less like a stranger and more like a mystery. Julian, sweaty, wiped his forehead with his hand. The arrogance that had once made him shine was beginning to crack. The audience no longer applauded his every gesture, but watched Don Ernesto Salgado's every move with anticipation. The old man held out his hand. Bring me a small lamp. I need to see in detail. No one moved at first, hesitating. It was Fernanda who took her cell phone, turned on the flashlight, and approached. The white light illuminated the metal parts of the engine, which gleamed like a hidden treasure. Don Ernesto leaned over and pointed calmly. Here, he said, touching a part with his fingertip. The fuel pump was replaced, but not adjusted to the correct gauge. If you insist on running this car, the pressure will fail. A young engineer among the guests, a specialist in luxury cars, stepped forward in surprise. He's right, he said, examining the area with incredulous eyes. I myself checked a similar Ferrari last month and saw the same mistake. The murmur grew. Every word the old man uttered became a sentence. Julian tried to regain control. Don't listen to him. This man doesn't even have a place to sleep. And you want to believe him about $1 million engine. But his words fell heavy, without echo. No one was laughing anymore. Don Ernesto looked up at him with an icy calm. Knowledge isn't measured by money, Julian. It's measured by experience and scars. The phrase cut through the room like a knife. Fernanda lowered the light from her cell phone to the old man's face. His eyes were shining, but not with greed. It was something deeper, something that resonated with truth. The guests began to change sides. Some murmured, "Who is this man? He talks as if he built this machine himself. He's not just anyone." Julian took a step back, cornered. Enough. No one here knows who you are. You're a ghost, a nobody. Don Ernesto took a deep breath. He could have answered right then and there. He could have revealed everything, but he didn't. He clutched the keys in his hand and remained silent. That silence weighed more than any words. Fernanda turned to the audience, unable to contain herself. We may not know who he is, she said firmly, but what he is demonstrating here is worth more than all our degrees and bank accounts. The room exploded in murmurs again. Julian, increasingly nervous, looked around for allies, but found no easy laughter. What had once been a complacent crowd was now a silent court. And in the center of it all, Don Ernesto stood tall with the serenity of someone who still had the strongest blow saved for last. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a cruel game was now a silent trial. The guests, dressed in their finery, were no longer drinking or laughing. They listened attentively to every word, every silence that formed around Don Ernesto Salgado. The old man, with the keys still in his hand, caressed the metal as if it were a tangible memory. His eyes, heavy with years and wounds, slowly rose to Julian Arce. You say that no one knows who I am. His voice boomed deep and slow. And you're right, because there are those who made sure I was forgotten. The murmur of the audience intensified. Fernanda took a step closer, her heart pounding. She had been waiting for that sentence since she saw the old man touch the Ferrari as if caressing a lost child. Julian nervously tried to interrupt. Enough with the mysteries. You are making this up. But Don Ernesto calmly raised his hand. and that gesture was enough to silence everyone. 30 years of my life, he said, his eyes fixed on the car. I spent my time among engines like this one, 30 years of grease on my hands, sleepless nights, perfecting every valve, every gear. Those present looked at each other in surprise. It didn't sound like improvisation, it was a confession. Cough? Someone asked from the back. Don Ernesto nodded, yes. 30 years in a factory where passion was not measured by watches or glasses of wine, but by sweat and dedication. And one day it all came to an end. Someone decided it was worthless. His words cut like a slow knife. Julian clenched his teeth. Sweaty. Lies, he said quietly, but his tone lacked conviction. Fernanda felt a chill. There was truth in every word the old man spoke. It was the truth of someone who had lived, not in luxury, but with sacrifice. Don Ernesto sighed, lowering his gaze for a moment, as if the images of the past were hitting him with violence. When you work so long at something, you never forget it. Even if they try to erase you, even if they abandon you, the knowledge remains here. He touched his 100 with a trembling finger and brought his hand to his chest. The silence was absolute. No one dared to move. An incredulous guest broke the silence. So, you were a mechanic? Don Ernesto looked at him sideways with a slight twinkle in his eyes. Mechanic. No, master. The murmur turned to amazement. Julian felt the earth move beneath his feet. People were beginning to connect the dots. Respect grew, and with it the pressure that pointed to him as the real imposter. Don Ernesto said no more. He remained silent, as if he knew that every word should be reserved for the right moment. The expectant room was burning with tension. Everyone sensed that what was to come would not be a simple anecdote, but a revelation capable of destroying Julian's false brilliance in front of everyone's eyes. The murmur became unbearable, like a swarm of voices demanding answers. No one took their eyes off Don Ernesto Salgado, who stood upright with a calmness that contrasted with Julian Arce's nervous trembling. The millionaire raised his hand, trying to regain authority. Don't listen to him. This old man is just looking for attention. I am the owner of this Ferrari. I am the one who worked hard to get it. The words rang hollow. Several heads turned toward him with suspicion. Fernanda crossed her arms and spoke without fear. You worked hard, Julian, or you inherited what you never built. A tense silence exploded in the room. Julian glared at her, but the young woman did not back down. Don Ernesto then took a deep breath and stepped forward. His deep, measured voice cut through the air. He did not seek attention, he sought justice. He paused in front of the audience as if speaking not to Julian, but to everyone present. For 30 years I worked at the Ferrari factory in Modena, 30 years in which I perfected engines like this one. I was head mechanic, I trained generations, I put my soul into every design. A murmur of astonishment ran through the crowd. Some knowledgeable about luxury cars opened their eyes in disbelief. But one day Don Ernesto continued with a bitter gleam in his eyes. They took everything from me. Betrayals, signatures that erased my name, decisions that threw me into abandonment. And do you know who was one of those responsible for that injustice? Faces turned toward Julian. The millionaire swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. That's a lie. I didn't even... Don Ernesto interrupted him with a firm wave of his hand. Your family, Julian, your father, your partners, they bought my silence. They took away the rights to my designs. They left me with nothing. And you grew up flaunting what didn't belong to you. The impact was brutal. The crowd erupted in exclamations. Some guests recoiled, others looked at each other in disbelief. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The old man's confidence, his knowledge, the way he treated the Ferrari like his own child. Julian took a step back, his voice breaking. You can't prove anything. You're crazy. Don Ernesto held up the keys, shining in the light like a symbol of truth. I don't need to prove it. I built it. This engine bears my fingerprints on every screw. The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared to speak. Fernanda, holding back tears, stepped forward. So this Ferrari is yours too. Don Ernesto slowly lowered his hand. I don't want this Ferrari as charity. I didn't come here to ask for charity. I came to claim what always belonged to me. My dignity, my name, my place in history. The entire crowd felt the weight of those words. Julian, devastated, looked for a way out, but everyone was looking at him no longer with admiration, but with contempt. The climax was served. What began as a mockery had now become the most painful trial of his life. The entire room was burning with tension. No one was drinking, no one was laughing. All eyes were fixed on Julian Arce, whose face had turned pale, distorted by a mixture of rage and fear. Don Ernesto Salgado, on the other hand, stood upright with the keys still in his hand, as if holding a symbol of truth that no one could take away from him. Julian tried to force a smile. "If you want them so much, old man, keep them." He threw his wine glass on a table and reached for the car. "I'll give you the Ferrari." The audience immediately began to murmur, not in approval but in discomfort. No one applauded. No one celebrated the gesture because everyone understood that it was not an act of generosity, but of desperation. Don Ernesto took a step forward, his shadow falling over Julian. His voice was low, but so firm that it resonated louder than a shout. "I don't want your Ferrari. I don't need alms to silence my story." The silence was total. The guests held their breath. "The only thing I want," continued the old man, his eyes shining with held-back tears, "is what you took from me. My name, my job, my life. You and your people condemned me to oblivion, but I'm still here. And tonight, in front of everyone, I'm regaining my dignity." The words weighed like hammer blows. Fernanda, moved, felt her eyes fill with tears. Several people in the audience nodded silently. The truth was unquestionable. Julian stumbled backward, tripping over the stage. "You have no proof. No one will believe you," he shouted, but his voice sounded broken. A guest raised his voice from the back. "I believe him." Another followed. "And me too." The murmur grew into a chorus of support. The audience that had been laughing with Julian now rose in defense of Don Ernesto. The looks that had previously despised him now surrounded him with respect. The old man lifted his chin and took a deep breath. "I didn't come here to steal anything. I came to remind you that the truth does not die, even if you try to bury it. That justice is slow, but it comes." Fernanda stepped forward and declared in a firm voice, "Tonight we have all seen who is the true owner of this respect." The applause began timidly, then grew until it filled the room. The sound hit Julian like a final verdict. The millionaire lowered his head, unable to hold the stares that pierced him. Don Ernesto left the keys on the hood of the Ferrari. He didn't need to take them with him. He had regained something much greater than a car. He had regained his name, his honor, his place in memory. As the applause enveloped him, he closed his eyes for a moment. A peace he hadn't known in years appeared on his tired face. The wound was still there, but his dignity had returned. And in that moment, the old man was no longer a beggar. He was a complete man. Once again, the echo of the applause that night was not just for one man, it was for the truth, for the dignity that had been reborn in front of everyone. Don Ernesto Salgado showed that poverty does not erase greatness and that a heart marked by sacrifice can shine brighter than any luxury. His story reminds us that no one has the right to humiliate another human being. Wealth, cars, jewelry, all of that can be lost. But dignity remains, and when it is defended with determination, it becomes an unstoppable force. Perhaps you or someone close to you has gone through something similar, a moment when laughter and contempt tried to make you feel less than. This story is a reminder that we should not accept humiliation from anyone. No one is worth more than anyone else. We all have a story, an effort, and a place in this world that deserves respect. If you want to share your experience, the comments section is a safe space to do so. Thank you for joining us until the end of this heartwarming story. Tell us in the comments what part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible power of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, check out the story I've left here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect. Yeah,